The night I discovered my husband married me for money, I stopped believing in love and started believing in revenge. My name is Seraphina Vale, daughter of the most feared crime lord on the East Coast. For 18 months, I ran. I hid. I pretended I could be normal. Then I fell for a man who saw dollar signs where I saw forever. Now I'm standing in a cathedral wearing a wedding dress worth more than his life, marrying someone else, while he watches from the crowd, finally understanding what he destroyed. If you want to see how far a broken heart can take you, stay until the end. Drop a like and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The rain in Seattle fell like it had a personal vendetta against optimism. Cold, relentless, the kind that soaked through cheap umbrellas and thrift store jackets until you felt it in your bones. Seraphina Vale, though she'd been calling herself Emma Russo for the past year and a half, stood behind the counter of Chen's Noodle House, watching water streak down the front window in patterns that reminded her of prison bars. Her hands smelled like garlic and grease. Her feet ached in shoes held together with duct tape and stubborn refusal to spend money she didn't have. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like dying insects, casting everything in that particular shade of exhausted yellow that made everyone look slightly sick. "Order up," Tony called from the kitchen, his voice rough from cigarettes and 40 years of breathing steam. Seraphina grabbed the plates without looking. Pad Thai for table 3. Spring rolls for the couple by the window. She moved through the narrow aisles between tables with the kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory and the desperate need to stay invisible. Because invisible was safe. Invisible meant her father's men hadn't found her yet. "Thanks, sweetie," the woman at table 3 said, barely glancing up from her phone. Seraphina smiled the smile she'd perfected over 18 months. Small, forgettable, the kind that didn't invite questions or conversation or any kind of attention that might make someone look too closely at the girl serving them $40 noodles. She'd been the princess of a criminal empire once. Silk dresses and armed escorts. Private jets and diplomatic immunity bought with blood money and strategic violence. Roman Vale's only daughter, the crown jewel of a syndicate that controlled everything from shipping routes to senators. Now she was Emma. Just Emma. Nobody. And she'd convinced herself that was enough, until Nolan Pierce walked through the door. He came in shaking rain from his jacket, dark hair plastered to his forehead, and when he smiled at her, it was the kind of smile that made her forget, just for a second, that she'd sworn off trusting anyone ever again. "Rough night?" he asked, settling onto a stool at the counter. Seraphina grabbed a menu she'd memorized months ago. "Every night's rough in Seattle. What can I get you?" "Coffee, black, and whatever you recommend that'll make me believe in second chances." She almost laughed. Almost. "That's a tall order for a Tuesday. I'm an optimist. Those don't usually last long in this neighborhood." But she poured his coffee anyway, and when their fingers brushed on the handoff, she felt something she'd been trying very hard not to feel for a year and a half. Hope. Dangerous, stupid, reckless hope. Nolan became a regular. 3 times a week, then 4, then almost every night he wasn't working late at the architecture firm downtown. He'd sit at the counter sketching building designs on napkins while Seraphina refilled his coffee and pretended she wasn't paying attention to the way his hands moved or the rough edge in his voice when he talked about the brownstone renovation project that was slowly killing his soul. "You ever think about getting out of here?" he asked one night, nodding at the restaurant around them. "Every single day," she admitted before she could stop herself. "What's stopping you?" "Everything." Her father's reach. The bounties she was sure existed somewhere in the criminal underworld. The fear that leaving this carefully constructed anonymity would mean going back to being Seraphina Vale, a name that carried more weight than she'd ever wanted to hold. But she couldn't say any of that, so instead she said, "Money." Same thing that stops everyone. Nolan looked at her like he was seeing something no one else had bothered to notice. "You're too smart to be stuck here." "Smart doesn't pay rent." "No," he agreed. "But it should count for something." 3 months later, he kissed her in the alley behind the restaurant after her shift ended at midnight. Rain fell between them, and the city smelled like wet concrete and possibility. His hands were rough from construction work, and his mouth tasted like the cheap whiskey they'd been sharing from a flask he kept in his jacket pocket. "I don't know anything about you," he murmured against her lips. Seraphina's heart hammered against her ribs. "What do you want to know?" "Everything." So she lied. She told him her name was Emma Russo, that she'd grown up in Cleveland with a single mother who'd died when she was 19, that she'd come to Seattle looking for a fresh start and found exactly what she expected: rain and disappointment and the occasional moment of something that felt almost like happiness. Nolan believed every word, or at least he seemed to. 6 months after that first kiss, he proposed in their tiny studio apartment with a ring he'd probably saved months to afford. It was simple, almost apologetically small, and when Seraphina looked at it, she felt her throat close up with something that felt dangerously close to the life she'd given up. "It's not much," Nolan said, nervous in a way she'd never seen him before. "But I figure we can build something together. Start small. Make it ours." Seraphina thought about the 10-carat diamond engagement ring waiting for her back in New York, part of an arranged marriage to some crime lord's son she'd never met. She thought about the life she was supposed to have lived, the cage built from gold bars and blood. Then she looked at Nolan's rough hands and warm eyes, and the future he was offering that had nothing to do with empires or violence or legacy. "Yes," she whispered. They got married at the courthouse on a Thursday afternoon with 2 strangers as witnesses and flowers Nolan had bought from a bodega on the corner. Seraphina wore a white dress from a thrift store, and Nolan wore the only suit he owned, and when the judge pronounced them husband and wife, she thought maybe, just maybe, she'd finally outrun her father's shadow. For 8 months, she believed the lie. They moved into a slightly larger apartment in Capitol Hill. Nolan got promoted. Seraphina started taking online classes in business administration because she'd always been good with numbers and logistics, and the kind of strategic thinking that made people uncomfortable when they realized how calculating she could be. Life felt almost normal, almost safe. Then came the night that shattered everything. Seraphina came home early from her shift to find Nolan at their kitchen table surrounded by papers she didn't recognize. Financial documents, background reports, photographs of her from years ago, back when she was still Seraphina Vale, still wearing designer clothes and attending charity galas as Roman Vale's untouchable daughter. Her blood went cold. "What is this?" Her voice came out steady despite the way her hands had started shaking. Nolan looked up. For a second, just one horrible second, she saw something in his face that made her stomach drop. Guilt. Not surprise. Not confusion. Guilt. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. He stood slowly, hands raised like she was a wild animal he didn't want to spook. "Emma, don't." The word came out sharp enough to cut. "Don't call me that." "How long?" Nolan's jaw tightened. From the beginning. The apartment went very still. Rain hammered against the windows. Somewhere down the hall, a neighbor's television played too loud. Seraphina stood in the doorway of the life she'd built and watched it collapse in real time. "Explain," she said. So he did. Every word felt like a knife sliding between her ribs. He'd been hired. Not by her father, never by Roman Vale, who would have dragged her home by force and locked her in the estate until she learned obedience. No, this was worse. A rival syndicate. One of the families constantly circling the Vale Empire like sharks smelling blood in the water. They'd tracked her to Seattle and sent Nolan, charming, struggling architect Nolan, to get close to her. The plan had been simple. Marry her, access her trust fund, leverage her name and connections. 18 months of carefully constructed intimacy. Every smile calculated, every touch measured, every whispered "I love you," part of a script designed to extract maximum value from the runaway princess stupid enough to believe someone could want her for something other than her last name. Some of it was real, Nolan said, and he had the audacity to sound like he meant it. "Emma, Seraphina, I didn't expect to actually—" "Stop talking." He stopped. Seraphina looked at the man she'd married and felt something inside her die very quietly and very permanently. Not her heart, that had learned survival instincts years ago in her father's world. Something else. Something softer that she'd been protecting like a candle flame in a hurricane. Hope. Trust. The belief that she could ever be anything other than an asset. "The divorce papers," she said flatly. "Where are they?" "You don't understand." "The papers, Nolan." He pulled them from a drawer. Pre-signed. Ready to file. Of course they were. This had always been temporary for him. Seraphina took them without looking at him again. Her hands didn't shake anymore. They felt steady and cold and very far away from the rest of her body. "You should have asked for more money," she said quietly. "My father would have paid triple what they're offering you just to know where I was." Then she walked out. She didn't pack, didn't take anything except her phone and the wallet she'd kept hidden in a false bottom of her dresser drawer, the one with her real ID and the credit card she'd never activated because using it would have been like shooting a flare into the sky, saying, "Find me." Seraphina Vale walked through Seattle rain one last time and activated the card. Within 30 minutes, her father's people had triangulated her location. Within 2 hours, a private car arrived to take her to the airport. Within 8 hours, she was standing in the marble foyer of the Vale estate in New York while Roman Vale held her like she'd come back from the dead. "My daughter," he said, voice rough with something that might have been relief or fury or both. "You're home." Seraphina looked at the security cameras, the armed guards, the empire built on violence and fear, and the kind of power that could bend entire cities to its will. She thought about Nolan's face when he'd admitted the truth, and she smiled. Not the small, forgettable smile she'd worn as Emma Russo. Something sharper, something that belonged to the girl who'd been raised to rule a kingdom built on blood. "Yes," she said. "I'm home." Her father studied her face like he was looking for cracks. "The alliance marriage, I'll do it," Roman blinked. "You'll what?" "Whatever syndicate needs shoring up, whatever political connection needs cementing, whatever merger makes us stronger." Seraphina met her father's eyes without flinching. "I'll marry whoever you need me to marry." Because Nolan had taught her something valuable in that tiny Seattle apartment. Love was a lie people told themselves to justify bad decisions. But power was honest. "There is one option," Roman said carefully. Lucien Darko. Seraphina knew the name. Everyone in their world knew the name. The Darko family had been building their empire for 3 generations. Politicians, judges, corporate boards, legitimate businesses wrapped around deeply illegitimate operations. Lucien was the heir. Mid-30s, educated in Europe, allegedly brilliant and absolutely ruthless. "When do I meet him?" she asked. "Tonight. He's expecting you for dinner." Of course he was. Seraphina went upstairs to her old bedroom, unchanged in the 18 months she'd been gone, like a shrine to the girl who'd run away. Designer clothes still hung in the closet. Jewelry still gleamed in velvet-lined boxes. She stripped off the thrift store sweater and cheap jeans. She put on a black dress that cost more than 3 months' rent at Chen's Noodle House. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Emma Russo had been soft, hopeful, naive enough to believe in second chances and courthouse weddings and love that existed outside of strategy. Seraphina Vale was something else entirely. The restaurant where she met Lucien Darko was the kind of place that didn't have prices on the menu because if you had to ask, you didn't belong there. Private room, crystal chandeliers, security so subtle you'd miss it if you weren't trained to notice such things. Lucien stood when she entered. He was taller than she'd expected, sharper, the kind of handsome that felt dangerous, all clean lines and expensive suits and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. "Seraphina Vale," he said, extending a hand. "You're more interesting than the photographs suggested." She shook his hand without smiling. Should I be flattered or concerned? Both, probably. They sat. A waiter appeared with wine Seraphina couldn't pronounce and appetizers she didn't touch. "Your father tells me you've reconsidered the arrangement," Lucien said, watching her over the rim of his glass. "I have." "Why?" "Because I learned something important recently." "What's that?" Seraphina met his eyes. "That honesty is more valuable than affection." Something flickered in Lucien's expression, not quite surprise, closer to recognition. "You don't want romance," he said. "I want partnership. And if I told you I have no interest in pretending to love you, I'd say that makes you the most honest man I've met in 2 years." Lucien smiled then. It was nothing like Nolan's smile. There was no warmth in it, no manipulation, just cold calculation and mutual understanding. "Your father wants to merge our operations," he said. "Shipping routes, money laundering networks, political connections. A marriage would cement the alliance. I'm aware." It would also make you one of the most powerful women on the East Coast. I'm aware of that too. And you want this? Seraphina thought about Seattle rain and courthouse vows, and the way Nolan's voice had cracked when he'd said some of it was real. She thought about trust and vulnerability and all the ways people could weaponize softness. Then she looked at Lucien Darko and saw something she'd never seen in Nolan Pierce. The truth. Yes, she said, I want this. They worked out the terms over dinner like a business transaction, because that's exactly what it was. The wedding would be massive. Political theater designed to announce the new alliance to every family, every rival, every federal agent watching their operations. Seraphina would have access to Darko financial systems. She'd learned the business from the inside. No more decorative daughter kept behind glass. She wanted real power, and Lucien seemed almost amused by her audacity. Most women in our world want to be protected, he said. I don't want protection. I want leverage. Dangerous ambition for someone who was serving noodles 6 days ago. I've always been dangerous, I just forgot for a while. As they finalized the arrangement, Seraphina felt something settle in her chest. Not happiness, nothing so simple. Purpose. She was done running, done hiding, done pretending she could be anything other than what she'd been born to be. Roman Vale's daughter. A weapon wrapped in silk. 3 weeks before the wedding, Seraphina did something that would have horrified the girl she'd been in Seattle. She sent Nolan an invitation, first-class plane ticket, 5-star hotel room, front row seat at the ceremony, because she wanted him to see exactly what he'd destroyed, and exactly what he would never touch again. The invitation arrived at his Seattle apartment with no return address, and no explanation beyond the embossed calligraphy announcing the marriage of Seraphina Vale and Lucien Darko. Nolan held the heavy cardstock and felt ice slide through his veins. He'd known her as Emma, the quiet waitress who'd smiled at his jokes and believed his lies and married him with cheap flowers and borrowed hope. Now he was staring at an invitation that listed her real name under a family crest he recognized from federal watch lists and organized crime databases. Vale. Roman Vale's daughter. The realization hit him like a freight train. He'd been played, not by some random runaway hiding from a bad childhood, by the daughter of the most dangerous man on the East Coast. And now she wanted him to watch her marry someone else. Nolan's hands shook as he pulled out his phone and dialed the number he'd been given when he'd taken this job. We have a problem, he said when the line connected. But Seraphina was already 3 steps ahead. She'd anticipated his panic, expected him to reach out to whoever had hired him, counted on desperation making him sloppy. Because that's what happened when you underestimated someone. You started making mistakes. The wedding preparations consumed Manhattan's elite underworld like a fever. Seraphina sat through fittings for a dress that cost more than most people's houses. She approved flower arrangements and seating charts and security protocols that would have made the Secret Service jealous. And every night, she sat in her father's study learning the business she'd run from. Shipping routes, money laundering systems, political leverage, the careful architecture of an empire built on violence and strategic intimidation. She had her father's head for numbers, his gift for seeing 3 moves ahead, his absolute certainty that power mattered more than morality. You've changed, Roman said one night, watching her review ledgers like she'd been doing it her whole life. I grew up. Seattle did that? Seattle taught me what happens when you trust the wrong person. Her father's expression darkened. The man who deceived you is handled. Seraphina? I said he's handled. Because Nolan Pierce was her mistake, and she would deal with him herself. The night before the wedding, Seraphina stood in her bedroom surrounded by white silk and diamond jewelry and the weight of everything she was about to become. Mrs. Lucien Darko, partner in an empire. The woman Nolan Pierce would watch walk down the aisle towards someone who'd never lied about wanting her for exactly what she was. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then curiosity, or maybe something darker, made her pick up. Seraphina. Nolan's voice cracked across the line. She said nothing. I know I don't have the right to call. I know what I did. But you have to understand. I don't have to understand anything. They threatened my sister, said they'd hurt her if I didn't, and you believed them instead of believing me. Silence stretched between them. Outside her window, Manhattan glittered with indifferent beauty. "I'm sorry," Nolan whispered. Seraphina felt nothing, no anger, no hurt, nothing but cold calculation. "You're coming to the wedding," she said. Seraphina, you're coming. You're going to sit in that chair and watch me marry someone who had the decency to be honest about what this was, and then you're going to understand something important." "What?" Her voice went very quiet, very cold. "That some mistakes don't get forgiveness. They just get consequences." She hung up. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the kind of weather that felt like the universe itself was holding its breath. Seraphina stood in front of the mirror while stylists arranged her hair and makeup artists made her face look like porcelain, and someone who wasn't her mother helped her into a dress that weighed more than armor. She looked like a bride from a magazine. She felt like a queen preparing for war. "5 minutes," someone called. Seraphina took one last breath as Emma Russo. Then she became Seraphina Darko. And when she stepped into that cathedral filled with 500 of the most powerful and dangerous people in North America, she didn't look for Nolan. She didn't need to. She could feel his eyes on her like a brand. Watching her walk toward the altar where Lucian Darko waited with the kind of calm that came from absolute certainty. Watching her take vows that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with power. Watching her become someone he could never reach again. The priest said words she barely heard. Lucian slid a ring onto her finger that probably cost more than Nolan's entire life. And when the ceremony ended and champagne flowed and Manhattan's elite toasted the new alliance, Seraphina finally allowed herself to look back. Nolan sat frozen 12 rows from the altar. His face had gone white. Their eyes met across crystal chandeliers and designer tuxedos and the unbridgeable distance between what he'd thought she was and what she'd always been. Seraphina smiled. Not Emma's soft smile, something sharper, something that said, "You had me when I was trying to be small. Now watch what happens when I decide to be dangerous." Then she turned away. Lucian took her hand and they walked together toward the reception while 500 people applauded, and Nolan Pierce finally understood the cost of his choices. But the night was far from over. Because at the Plaza ballroom reception, surrounded by champagne fountains, and enough security to invade a small country, Nolan did something spectacularly stupid. He approached her. Seraphina saw him coming through the crowd, pale, determined, the kind of desperate that made people reckless. Lucian's hand tightened slightly on her waist. "Want me to handle this?" "No." Her voice was silk over steel. "He's mine." Nolan stopped 3 feet away, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath. "You could have told me," he said quietly, "who you really were." Seraphina looked at him like he was a stranger. "You didn't marry Emma Russo because you loved her," she said. "You married her because you thought she was exploitable." Some of it was real. None of it was real. She leaned closer, voice dropping. "You want to know the difference between you and him?" She nodded toward Lucian. "He never pretended I was anything other than leverage. You pretended I was lovable." Nolan's jaw tightened. "I made a mistake." "No, you made a calculation, and you lost." Then she walked away on Lucian's arm while Nolan stood frozen among people worth more than he'd earned in 10 lifetimes. But as the reception swirled around them, toasts and dancing and the careful theater of power, Seraphina felt her phone buzz in her purse. Unknown number, different from Nolan's. She slipped away to read it. The message made her blood run cold. "The divorce was never filed. Your marriage to Pierce is still legally valid. Your current marriage is void. Pay us $50 million or we go public and destroy both families." Seraphina's hands went very still. Someone, probably whoever had hired Nolan in the first place, had been waiting for exactly this moment. The perfect trap. And she'd walked right into it. The bathroom at the plaza was all marble and gold fixtures and the kind of silence that felt like drowning. Seraphina locked the door and read the message again, her wedding dress suddenly feeling less like armor and more like a cage. The divorce was never filed. Your marriage to Pierce is still legally valid. Your current marriage is void. Pay us $50 million or we go public and destroy both families. Her hands didn't shake. That surprised her. She'd expected rage or panic or something hot and immediate. Instead, she felt cold, calculating. The part of her brain that Roman Vale had trained since childhood kicked into gear like a weapon sliding out of its holster. She pulled up the divorce document she'd signed the night she left Seattle, scanned through the filing timestamps, the courthouse records. Nothing. Nolan had never submitted them, which meant for the past 3 weeks while she'd been planning this wedding, while she'd been learning the Darko financial systems and cementing alliances and transforming herself into someone untouchable, she'd still been legally married to a con artist who'd sold her out for cash. Seraphina stared at a reflection in the mirror. $20,000 worth of makeup, a dress that had taken 6 people to construct, diamond earrings that could have fed a small country. All of it built on a legal foundation that was about to crumble. She typed a response with hands that felt detached from her body. Who is this? The answer came back in seconds. Someone who knows exactly how much this information is worth. You have 48 hours. Seraphina deleted the messages and walked back to her wedding reception like nothing had changed. Lucien noticed immediately. He always noticed. It was part of what made him dangerous. Problem? He asked quietly, handing her a glass of champagne she didn't want. Nothing I can't handle. His eyes narrowed. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're getting right now. Around them, 500 guests celebrated the union that might not legally exist. Senators made toasts. Crime lords clinked glasses. Cameras flashed like artillery fire, while Manhattan's elite performed the careful dance of power and pretense. Seraphina smiled and nodded and played her part perfectly. But inside she was already 3 moves ahead, calculating angles and exit strategies, and exactly how much blood this was going to cost. The reception ended near midnight. Lucien's penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building in Tribeca, with views that made the city look small and manageable and completely under control. Seraphina had been there twice before during the engagement, clinical visits where they discussed prenuptial agreements in separate bedrooms, and the professional boundaries of a marriage built on strategy rather than sentiment. Now she stood in the master suite while Lucien poured whiskey at the bar, and she tried to figure out how to tell him their marriage might be invalid without triggering a war. "You gonna tell me what's wrong?" Lucien asked, not turning around. "How do you know something's wrong?" "Because you've been somewhere else since we left the plaza." Seraphina kicked off shoes that cost more than her old apartment and felt her feet scream with relief. "We have a situation." Defined situation. The kind that could invalidate our marriage and turn this alliance into a legal nightmare. That got his attention. He turned slowly, whiskey glass frozen halfway to his mouth. "Explain." So she did. Every word tasted like broken glass. The message, the divorce that was never filed, the marriage to Nolan that technically still existed, the blackmail demand that would destroy both families if this became public. Lucien listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set his glass down very carefully and walked to the window. Manhattan glittered below them like scattered diamonds on black velvet. "How long have you known?" His voice was too quiet. "Since the reception, maybe 2 hours." "And you didn't think to mention it before now?" "I was deciding how much it would cost to make it disappear." He laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. "You were deciding, alone, about a situation that affects both of us. I'm the one who brought this mess into the alliance. We're supposed to be partners." He turned and the look on his face made something in Seraphina's chest tighten. Not anger exactly, something colder. That was the deal. Honesty, full disclosure, no games. "I'm telling you now." 2 hours late, the silence stretched between them like broken glass. Outside, the city hummed with indifferent life. Taxis honked. People laughed on sidewalks. The world kept spinning while their carefully constructed empire threatened to crack at the foundation. "What do you want me to say?" Seraphina asked finally. "I want you to trust me enough to bring me problems before you've already decided how to solve them." "I don't know how to do that." "Learn." He poured another whiskey, drank it in one swallow. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call that Seraphina couldn't quite hear from across the room. When he hung up, his face had shifted into something harder, more familiar, the ruthless efficiency that had built the Darko Empire into what it was. "My lawyers will pull every record related to your Seattle marriage," he said. "We'll verify whether the divorce was actually filed or if this is just intimidation with no teeth. And if it wasn't filed, then we fix it. Fast. Before anyone else figures out there's blood in the water. Seraphina felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly, more like the recognition that she wasn't alone in this particular disaster. "Thank you," she said quietly. Lucian looked at her like he was seeing something he hadn't expected. "Don't thank me. This is self-preservation. If our marriage is invalid, the entire alliance collapses. Every deal we brokered becomes void. Every territory we consolidated becomes contested. We'd be looking at a war." "I know." "Do you?" He moved closer, close enough that she could smell expensive cologne and whiskey. "Because from where I'm standing, you still think you're fighting this alone. Old habits. Break them." Then he walked to the second bedroom, separate quarters, professional boundaries, the terms they'd agreed to, and closed the door with a finality that felt like punctuation. Seraphina stood alone in the suite and felt the weight of her wedding dress trying to drag her under. She'd traded one cage for another, just a more expensive one. The lawyers confirmed it the next morning. Nolan had never filed the divorce. Seraphina's marriage to him was still legally recognized in Washington state, which meant her marriage to Lucian was void pending resolution. Roman Vale received the news like a death sentence. How did this happen? He stood in his study surrounded by mahogany and leather and 40 years of accumulated power. How did we miss this? Because I trusted the wrong person to do what he promised. Seraphina sat in a chair that felt like an interrogation. My mistake. Your mistake could cost us everything. I'm aware. Are you? Roman leaned forward, hands flat on his desk. Every family watching this alliance is looking for weakness. Every rival waiting for an opening. If they find out our cornerstone marriage is legally invalid, they won't find out. You don't know that. I know we have 40 hours left to fix this before whoever sent that message goes public. Roman's jaw tightened. Who else knows? Lucien, his lawyers. Now you. Keep it that way. He pulled out his phone with hands that shook slightly, the only sign of how badly this rattled him. I'll have Pierce brought in. We'll make him sign whatever we need. No. Roman looked up sharply. Excuse me? Nolan doesn't get to fix this. He's already done enough damage. Seraphina, this isn't about revenge. It's exactly about revenge and leverage and making sure everyone involved understands what happens when they try to manipulate a veil. Her father studied her face like he was looking at a stranger. What are you planning? To handle my own mess. She left before he could argue. The address came from one of her father's security contacts, the kind of information that existed in the gray space between legal investigation and outright stalking. Nolan was staying at a cheap hotel in Hell's Kitchen, probably burning through whatever money he'd been paid to destroy her life. Seraphina arrived with 2 bodyguards and enough rage to burn down the building. The room was exactly what she expected. Unmade bed, empty whiskey bottles, clothes scattered across furniture that had seen better decades. Nolan sat by the window in a chair that didn't match anything else, staring at nothing. He looked up when she entered and something like fear flickered across his face. Seraphina, why didn't you file the divorce? He stood slowly. I can explain. That wasn't a request for conversation. It was a question with one answer. Nolan's hands flexed at his sides. They told me not to, said it was insurance. In case you tried to come after them legally. Who's they? I don't know names. Just the guy who hired me. Said he represented interests that wanted leverage against your family. Seraphina moved closer and watched him flinch. Good. He should be afraid. You kept me legally bound to you, she said quietly. For 18 months you've had a claim on everything I am. My name, my assets, my future. And you sat on it like a loaded gun waiting for the right moment to fire. I didn't know they'd use it like this. Yes, you did. You just didn't care. The silence in that cheap hotel room felt like suffocation. I need you to sign new divorce papers, Seraphina said, backdated, filed immediately, and then I need you to disappear. And if I don't? She smiled. It was Roman Vale's smile, the one that made politicians nervous and judges cooperative. Then I'll make you wish you'd never learned my name. Nolan looked at her, really looked at her, and she watched him finally see the truth. This wasn't Emma Russo asking nicely. This was Seraphina Vale delivering terms. How do I know you won't come after me anyway? He asked. You don't. But at least this way you get a head start. He signed. The documents were prepared by lawyers who didn't ask questions, backdated to the day Seraphina had left Seattle. Filed electronically with enough legal grease to slide through the system in hours instead of weeks. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like cauterizing a wound that would never fully heal. I really did care about you, Nolan said as she was leaving. Some part of it was real. Seraphina paused in the doorway, looked back at the man who'd taught her that vulnerability was just another word for target. The problem with some of it, she said, is that I'll never know which parts to believe. Then she left him there and didn't look back. But the blackmail didn't stop. The next message arrived 6 hours later while Seraphina sat in Lucian's office going through shipping manifests like they were battle plans. Divorce papers don't matter. We have recordings of Pierce admitting the whole operation. Audio of you discussing your real identity. Photographs of you from Seattle. Everything we need to prove you knew about the marriage fraud. $50 million, 24 hours. Or we send it all to the FBI and every rival family watching this alliance. Lucienne read over her shoulder and swore quietly. They're not after money, they're after chaos. What makes you say that? Because $50 million is pocket change for what this information is actually worth. They could have asked for twice that, and we'd have paid it. This is about destabilization. Seraphina felt cold settle in her bones. Someone wants this alliance to fail. Someone wants it to explode spectacularly and take both our families down with it. He pulled up files on his computer, surveillance reports, financial tracking, the kind of intelligence that costs 6 figures to maintain. Names and faces of every family that had reason to want the Vale Darko alliance destroyed. There were dozens. The Kozlov family in Brooklyn, the Marchetti Syndicate in Philadelphia, the Chen Network on the West Coast, every organization that had lost territory or influence or leverage when Roman Vale and Thomas D'Arco had announced their children's engagement. We need to find out who hired Pierce, Lucienne said, before they release whatever they're holding. I tried. He doesn't know names. Everyone knows something. Lucienne made 3 calls in rapid succession, each one quieter and more dangerous than the last. By the time he hung up, Seraphina could see the plan forming behind his eyes. What are you thinking? She asked. That we stop playing defense. Meaning we find whoever's blackmailing us and we make them understand why threatening the Darkos was a fatal mistake. It should have scared her, the casual way he discussed violence like it was a business strategy. Instead, Seraphina felt something that might have been gratitude. This was honest. No pretense about love or protection or anything soft enough to be used as a weapon. Just cold strategy and mutual survival. I want in, she said. Lucian looked at her carefully. This isn't a game. I never thought it was. People might get hurt. Good. Something shifted in his expression, not quite approval, more like recognition. Your father was right, Lucian said quietly. You really are his daughter. The plan came together over the next 12 hours. Seraphina sat in on meetings she shouldn't have been allowed near. Security consultations, surveillance reports, strategy sessions with men who'd killed people and slept fine afterward. She absorbed every word like gospel. Lucienne's head of security, a man named Victor who'd done 3 tours in places the government didn't acknowledge, tracked the blackmail messages to a burner phone purchased in Midtown. From there it was cameras and facial recognition and the kind of digital forensics that skirted about 6 federal laws. The trail led to a man named Marcus Delgado, low-level enforcer for the Marchetti family in Philadelphia. Smart enough to be dangerous, stupid enough to think he could blackmail 2 crime dynasties and walk away intact. He's staying at the Grand Hyatt, Victor said, sliding photographs across the conference table. Room 2847, 2 associates, both armed. When do we move? Seraphina asked. Lucienne looked at her. We don't. Victor's team handles this. Like hell! Seraphina! He used my marriage, my past, my mistakes. I'm not sitting here while someone else cleans up my mess. The room went very quiet. Victor looked at Lucienne like he was waiting for permission to laugh or throw her out. Lucienne just studied her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. You understand what you're asking, he said finally. I understand exactly what I'm asking. This isn't like your father's study or a boardroom negotiation. This is the part where people bleed. I know. Do you? He leaned forward. Because once you cross this line, you don't get to go back to being the runaway princess who served noodles and believed in courthouse weddings. Seraphina met his eyes without flinching. That girl died in Seattle. I'm just making it official. Lucian studied her for another long moment. Then he nodded once at Victor. She comes, but she follows every order exactly. No improvisation, no heroics, clear? Victor looked like he'd swallowed glass, but he nodded. Seraphina felt something settle in her chest that might have been acceptance, or might have been the last piece of her old self finally letting go. They moved at 3 a.m. when Manhattan was as quiet as it ever got. 3 SUVs with tinted windows and enough firepower in the trunks to start a war. Victor's team moved like shadows, silent, efficient, the kind of people who made problems disappear and never lost sleep over it. Seraphina wore black, tactical gear that fit like a second skin, comms in her ear feeding her information in Victor's clipped military cadence. Target's awake, he said. Lights on in the room. 2 heat signatures. 3rd is in the bathroom. They entered through a service entrance that Victor's contacts had left conveniently unlocked. Rode a freight elevator that smelled like cleaning chemicals and desperation. The hallway on the 28th floor was empty, security cameras mysteriously offline. Victor signaled his team into position. 2 men flanking the door, another at the stairwell. Lucian standing close enough to Seraphina that she could hear him breathing. Last chance to wait in the car, he said quietly. Not happening. Victor knocked. Professional. Almost polite. The door opened and Marcus Delgado looked at them with the expression of a man who knew he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. He tried to slam the door. Victor's boot stopped it. What happened next was over in seconds. Victor's team poured into the room like water through broken glass. Marcus went down hard. His associates surrendered before they even reached for their weapons. Seraphina walked in last and watched 3 grown men realize exactly how badly they'd underestimated the situation. Where's the recordings? Lucian asked. His voice was conversational, terrifying in its calm. Marcus tried to laugh. It came out strangled. You think I'm stupid enough to keep them here? I think you're stupid enough to try blackmailing people who own half of Manhattan. Marchetti family's got copies. You hurt me, you start a war you can't win. Victor hit him. Once. Hard enough that Seraphina heard something crack. Marcus screamed. Let me clarify the situation, Lucian said. You don't have leverage anymore. You have seconds to tell us where the recordings are before this gets significantly worse for you. Blood ran from Marcus's nose. He looked at Seraphina like she might somehow be softer, more sympathetic. Please, he gasped. I was just following orders. So was I, Seraphina said. When I walked in here, she pulled the phone from his jacket herself, handed it to Victor, who connected it to some device that probably cost more than Marcus's life. Cloud storage, Victor said after a moment. Encrypted. Give me the password. I can't. Victor broke his finger. The scream was louder this time. Seraphina didn't look away, didn't flinch. Just watched Marcus Delgado learn the same lesson Nolan had learned in that Seattle apartment. Some mistakes don't get second chances. They just get consequences. The password came 5 minutes later along with crying apologies and desperate promises about cooperation. Victor downloaded everything. Photos, recordings, documents proving the entire blackmail scheme traced back to the Marchetti family's second-in-command. Proof of war. What do we do with him? One of Victor's men asked, nodding at Marcus who'd curled into himself on the carpet. Lucien looked at Seraphina. Your call. She knew what he was really asking. This was the line. The point where theory became practice and nice girls from criminal families decided whether they were actually willing to get their hands dirty. Seraphina thought about Nolan's face when he'd admitted the truth. About 18 months of running and hiding and trying to be someone small enough to escape her father's shadow. About every man who'd ever looked at her and seen an asset instead of a person. Then she thought about power, real power, the kind that made people afraid to even consider using you. Make sure he understands the cost of threatening us, she said quietly. Then make sure the Marchetti family receives whatever's left. Victor smiled. It wasn't kind. Yes, ma'am. They left Marcus Delgado in that hotel room, and Seraphina never asked what happened after. Some questions didn't need answers. By morning, the recordings were destroyed. The blackmail scheme was dismantled, and the Marchetti family received a very clear message about the cost of destabilizing the Val d'Arco alliance. Seraphina sat in Lucien's penthouse watching dawn break over Manhattan while Victor's team cleaned up loose ends she didn't want to think about. "How do you feel?" Lucien asked, handing her coffee that was probably too expensive to waste on moral hangovers. "Like I just burned the last bridge back to Seattle." "Regret?" She thought about it, really considered whether any part of her missed the girl who'd believed in love and second chances and the possibility of normal life. "No," she said finally. "I don't think I do." That should probably scare you. It probably should. But it didn't. For the first time since walking out of that cheap apartment, Seraphina felt like she'd stopped pretending. No more performance. No more hiding behind fake names and small ambitions. Just the truth. Cold and sharp and honest as a knife. Lucien sat beside her and they watched the city wake up together. Two people who'd married for strategy and survived their first real crisis through violence and mutual calculation. "We should probably talk," he said, "about what happens next." "Meaning? Meaning we just declared war on the Marchetti family. They're not going to let this go quietly." Seraphina sipped coffee that tasted like smoke and expensive beans. "Good." "Good?" "I'm tired of playing defense, tired of reacting to other people's moves. They want a war?" She looked at him. "Let's give them one they'll never forget." Something shifted in Lucien's expression, not quite surprise, more like realization. "You really are dangerous," he said quietly. "I'm learning." "From who?" "You, my father. Every man who ever taught me that power matters more than being liked." "And Nolan?" She set her coffee down carefully. "Nolan taught me that mercy is just another word for weakness." Outside, Manhattan stretched toward a horizon that felt newly negotiable. Seraphina had crossed the line in that hotel room. Walked past the point where running away was still an option. Now there was only forward. Into the empire she was building. Into the person she was becoming. Into a war she'd helped start and fully intended to finish. The phone rang 3 hours later. Unknown number. Seraphina almost didn't answer. Then something, instinct or paranoia or pattern recognition, made her pick up. "Mrs. Darko." The voice was smooth, professional, faintly amused. "Or should I still call you Mrs. Pierce?" Her blood went cold. "Who is this?" "Someone who appreciated your work last night with Mr. Delgado. Very efficient, very ruthless, exactly the kind of message the Marchettis needed to receive. How do you know about it? Because I have eyes everywhere, including inside your husband's security team." Seraphina looked at Lucien. His face had gone very still. "What do you want?" she asked. The voice laughed. "To make you an offer. You've proven you're willing to get your hands dirty, to cross lines, to become exactly what your father raised you to be. I respect that." "I'm not interested." "You haven't heard the offer yet. I can make the Marchetti problem disappear, completely, along with any other families considering moves against your alliance. All I need is one small favor." "There's no such thing as small favors." "Smart girl. You're right. It's not small, but it's necessary." The voice paused. "I need you to kill your father." The world tilted sideways. "Excuse me?" Roman Vale has become a liability. Too old. Too traditional. Too convinced that loyalty matters more than profit. The underworld is evolving, and he's standing in the way. But you... Another pause. "You're perfect. Young enough to adapt, ruthless enough to survive, connected enough through your marriage to actually hold the empire together. You're insane." "I'm practical, and you have 24 hours to decide. Refuse, and I release proof that you personally ordered Marcus Delgado's torture. FBI gets copies. Every news network. Every rival family. You'll spend the next 20 years in federal prison while the alliance crumbles and your father's empire gets carved up like a holiday turkey." The line went dead. Seraphina stood frozen in Lucien's penthouse, while Manhattan stretched below them and her entire world threatened to collapse for the second time in 3 days. Lucien took the phone from her shaking hands. What did they say? She told him. Every word felt like swallowing glass. When she finished, Lucien's face had gone completely expressionless. The kind of blank that meant he was thinking through scenarios faster than most people could follow. They're trying to fracture the alliance from the inside, he said finally. Turn daughter against father, create chaos, weaken both families simultaneously. I know. If you refuse, they destroy me legally. If I agree... She couldn't finish the sentence. If she agreed, she became the kind of person who killed their own father for power. The kind of person she'd been running from in Seattle. The kind of person she'd been becoming since walking into that hotel room. There's a third option, Lucien said carefully. What? We find out who's pulling these strings before they can make good on their threats. In 24 hours? We've done more with less time. Seraphina looked at him, really looked, and saw something she hadn't expected. Partnership. Real partnership. Not the transactional arrangement they'd agreed to, but actual trust forged through violence and mutual survival. You believe me, she said, about not wanting to hurt my father. Should I not? Most people would assume I'm ambitious enough to consider it. Most people aren't married to you. He moved closer. I've watched you these past weeks. Studied how you think, how you move through problems. You're ruthless, yes. Dangerous, absolutely. But patricide? He shook his head. That's not your style. You'd find another way, something more surgical. Something in Seraphina's chest loosened slightly. So we find whoever's running this operation, she said, and we make them regret ever thinking the Darkos and Vales were easy targets. Exactly. Where do we start? Lucien pulled out his phone and made a call that lasted 6 seconds. When he hung up, his expression had hardened into something that looked like war. We start, he said, by finding out which of my security team has been selling us out. Because if someone had eyes inside their operation, someone close enough to know about Marcus Delgado and the hotel room and every move they'd made in the past 72 hours, then this wasn't just blackmail anymore. This was infiltration. And whoever was behind it wasn't just trying to destroy the alliance. They were trying to take over everything. Victor was dead before they could question him. They found him in his apartment in Queens at 4 a.m, 3 bullets to the chest, 1 to the head, professional execution in a building with cameras that had mysteriously stopped working 2 hours before the killing. Lucien stood in the doorway looking at his head of security sprawled across expensive carpeting, and Seraphina watched something dangerous settle behind his eyes. Whoever's doing this moves fast, he said quietly, or they knew we'd figure out Victor was compromised. Same thing. The apartment had been tossed. Not ransacked exactly, too careful for that. But drawers hung open, papers scattered across the desk. Someone had been looking for something and hadn't bothered hiding the search. Seraphina moved through the space like she'd been trained for this. Which she hadn't, not really. But 18 months of survival instincts and 3 weeks of watching her father's operations had taught her how to read a crime scene. She found the safe behind a painting in the bedroom. Empty, door hanging open like a mouth mid-scream. They got whatever he was keeping, she called out. Lucien appeared in the doorway. Insurance, probably. Proof he was working for someone. Leverage in case things went sideways. Things went very sideways. For him. Not necessarily for whoever hired him. They left before the police arrived. Inevitable in this neighborhood where gunshots drew attention and bodies drew investigations that neither family could afford right now. The SUV that picked them up smelled like leather and gun oil. The driver was someone new. Someone Lucien trusted. Maybe. Trust had become a loaded word in the past 72 hours. We need to go to ground, Lucien said, staring out the window as Queens blurred into Manhattan. Figure out who we can actually rely on. My father is a target. You go anywhere near him right now, you paint a bullseye on both your backs. Seraphina's hands clenched in her lap. So what? We just hide? Wait for whoever's orchestrating this to make their next move? We regroup, assess, stop reacting, and start planning. That sounds like losing. That sounds like surviving long enough to win. The safe house was in Brooklyn, an industrial building that had been converted into something that looked abandoned from the outside but was fortified like a military installation on the inside. Reinforced walls. Surveillance systems that probably violated 6 constitutional amendments. Enough weapons in the basement to stage a coup. Lucian's second-in-command met them at the door. A woman named Elena, who looked like she could kill you with a dessert spoon and smile while doing it. She'd been with the Darko family for 15 years, which either meant she was loyal or exceptionally good at playing long games. "Victor's dead," she said without preamble. "I'm assuming you know." "We found him," Lucian replied. "What do you know that we don't?" "That he's been moving money into offshore accounts for the past 6 months. Small amounts, nothing that would trigger flags. But it adds up to about 2 million. Payment for services rendered." "That'd be my guess." Elena handed him a tablet loaded with financial records that shouldn't have been accessible to anyone outside federal law enforcement. He was careful, used shell companies, Bitcoin transfers, but he got sloppy near the end. Seraphina studied the numbers over Lucian's shoulder. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Regular deposits, always after major alliance meetings or strategy sessions. Victor had been selling information the entire time. "How far back does this go?" she asked. Elena looked at her like she was calculating whether Seraphina could handle the answer. "Before your engagement was announced." The implication hit like a freight train. Whoever was behind this hadn't just infiltrated the alliance after it formed. They'd been working against it from the beginning, possibly before the beginning. "Someone knew about the marriage before we did," Seraphina said slowly. Lucian's face had gone very still. "Which means they had access to conversations between our fathers, private negotiations, strategic planning at the highest levels. So we're looking at someone inside both families, or someone who owns people inside both families." The room went quiet except for the hum of surveillance equipment and the distant sound of Brooklyn traffic. Seraphina felt the walls closing in. Not the physical walls of this safe house. Those were solid enough. The invisible walls built from paranoia and the realization that trust was a luxury they couldn't afford anymore. "I need to call my father," she said. "Absolutely not." Lucian's voice carried an edge she hadn't heard before. "Your phone could be compromised. This location could be compromised. Any communication with Roman Vale right now puts both of you at risk. He needs to know, but he needs to stay alive long enough for us to figure out who's trying to kill him." "You think they're actually going to try?" The voice on the phone, it could have been a bluff. Does it feel like a bluff to you? It didn't. Nothing about the past 3 days felt like theater. This was real. Surgical. Someone with resources and patience and a plan that had been in motion for months. Elena cleared her throat. "There's something else. Victor's phone records show he made 17 calls to a number registered to a dummy corporation in Delaware. I'm running it down, but it's going to take time." "How much time?" Seraphina asked. "More than we probably have." Lucian ran a hand through his hair. First sign of frustration she'd seen from him. "What about the voice on the phone? The one demanding Seraphina kill her father. Can we trace that?" "Burner. Probably already destroyed. They're professionals." "So are we." "Not like this." Elena looked between them. "Whoever's running this operation has been planning it for months. Maybe years. They've got people inside our security, our financial systems, our communications networks. This isn't some rival family making a play. This is systematic dismantling." The words hung in the air like smoke. Seraphina thought about Marcus Delgado bleeding on hotel carpeting, about Nolan's face when he'd signed those divorce papers, about every move she'd made since coming back to New York that had felt like taking control, but might have been exactly what someone wanted her to do. "What if we're playing into it?" she said quietly. "What?" "Everything we've done, coming here, investigating Victor, even the marriage itself. What if it's all part of their plan?" Lucian looked at her like she'd just said something either brilliant or insane. "You think we're being manipulated?" "I think we're being predictable. They knew I'd come back to New York after Nolan. Knew I'd agree to the alliance marriage. Knew exactly which buttons to push to make us react instead of think. So what do you suggest?" "We do something unpredictable." Elena laughed. It wasn't a kind sound. "Like what? Commit suicide by rival syndicate? Because that's what unpredictable gets you in our world." But Seraphina was already thinking 3 moves ahead, the way her father had taught her, the way she'd learned watching Lucian navigate the past weeks. "We give them what they want," she said, "or at least make them think we are." "Elaborate." Lucien's voice carried warning. They want my father dead, want the alliance fractured, want both families weakened and fighting each other instead of consolidating power. So we stage it. Make it look like I actually went through with their demand. The room went very quiet. You want to fake Roman Vale's death, Elena said slowly. And frame yourself for it. Not frame. Claim responsibility. Announce that I've taken control of the Vale operations. Create chaos. Force whoever's behind this to reveal themselves because their plan will have worked better than they expected. That's insane, Lucien said flatly. That's unpredictable. That's a death sentence. Every family loyal to your father would come after you. Every rival would see blood in the water. You'd be painting a target on yourself that would last the rest of your very short life. Unless we control the narrative. Make it look like a power play. Like I've evolved into exactly what they were trying to create. Seraphina stood and started pacing. The plan was forming faster than she could articulate it, but the bones were solid. Announce Roman Vale's death. Take credit. Declare herself the new head of the Vale Syndicate with Lucien's backing. Force whoever was orchestrating this to make their next move while they thought they were winning. It's too dangerous, Lucien said, but she could hear calculation in his voice now. He was running scenarios, testing angles. Everything's dangerous. At least this way we're driving instead of getting driven. Elena pulled up a tactical map on her tablet. If you're serious about this, and I'm not saying you should be, we'd need to move fast. Stage the death within hours. Get Roman somewhere secure before the news breaks. Lock down both family operations before anyone has time to react. Can it be done? Seraphina asked. Technically, yes. Strategically, it's a nightmare. You'd be betting everything on the idea that whoever's behind this will believe you actually killed your own father. They already think I'm capable of it. They wouldn't have made the demand otherwise. Lucien walked to the window overlooking Brooklyn. Dawn was starting to break, pink light bleeding across industrial buildings and the distant Manhattan skyline. When he turned back, his face carried the expression of someone making a decision that couldn't be unmade. If we do this, he said carefully, there's no going back. You'll be committed to playing the patricidal daughter until we can expose whoever's actually pulling strings. That means lying to everyone. Your father's allies, our business partners, people who've known you since you were a child. One wrong move and they'll tear you apart. I know. Do you? Because this isn't a hotel room interrogation or signing divorce papers. This is declaring yourself a monster to the only world you've ever known. Seraphina thought about Emma Russo serving noodles and believing in love, about Seraphina Vale trying to run from her father's empire, about every version of herself she'd been and discarded and buried. I've been a lot of things, she said quietly. Maybe it's time to be terrifying. Elena made 3 calls. Lucien made 7. Within an hour, they had the skeleton of a plan that would either save both families or destroy them completely. Roman Vale would be moved to a secure location upstate, a compound the Darko family maintained for exactly these kinds of situations. He'd be kept in lockdown with a skeleton crew of people loyal enough to stay silent even under pressure. The death would be staged at the Vale estate. Crime scene investigators on the Darko payroll would confirm it. Medical examiner who owed favors would sign off on cause of death. The body would be a John Doe from the morgue, similar build, similar age, damaged enough that identification would be difficult but not impossible. And Seraphina would announce to Manhattan's underworld that she'd killed her father to take control of the empire. The hardest part was telling Roman. They brought him to the safe house at noon. He arrived surrounded by security that didn't know where they were going until they arrived. Operational security that Elena insisted on. When Roman walked through the door and saw Seraphina, his face went through about 6 emotions before settling on something close to relief. You're alive, he said, crossing the room to pull her into an embrace that felt like coming home and cage bars simultaneously. I'm fine. You're not fine. Victor's dead. Half my security team is on alert, and you disappeared for 12 hours without explanation. Seraphina stepped back. We need to talk, and you're not going to like it. She explained the plan while her father stood motionless in the center of the room. When she finished, Roman looked at Lucien like he'd just suggested burning down the Vatican. You want me to fake my own death, he said slowly, and let my daughter claim she murdered me. Yes, Lucien replied without hesitation. That's the stupidest thing I've heard in 40 years of criminal enterprise. It's also our best option. Our best option is finding whoever's threatening us and putting bullets in them. We can't find them if we don't know who they are. This flushes them out. Roman turned to Seraphina. You understand what you're proposing? Every man who's loyal to me will want you dead. Every rival family will see weakness and move on our territory. The alliance itself, everything we've built, will survive because Lucien and I will hold it together, Seraphina said, but only if we stop reacting and start controlling the situation. By painting yourself as a patricidal sociopath, by becoming the kind of threat that makes people reveal themselves. Her father looked at her like he was seeing a stranger. Seattle really did change you. No, coming home did. The silence stretched between them. Outside, Brooklyn moved through its afternoon routines, completely unaware that in this warehouse, two crime dynasties were gambling everything on a plan that would either expose their enemies or destroy them from within. When? Roman asked finally. Tonight, Elena said. We stage it after dark. Announce it by morning, give you 24 hours to get upstate before anyone starts asking questions we can't answer. And my people? Will be told you're dead and Seraphina's in charge. Those who accept it stay. Those who don't. She shrugged. We deal with them. Roman looked at his daughter for a long time. Seraphina held his gaze without flinching. She'd crossed too many lines in the past 3 days to back down now. You're sure about this? He asked. No, but I'm sure doing nothing gets us all killed. That's not reassuring. It's honest. Something that might have been pride flickered across Roman's face. Your mother would have hated this. Mom would have found a better plan. Probably. He nodded once at Lucien. Keep her alive. That's the goal. Not good enough. I want a guarantee. There are no guarantees in this business. You know that. Then make an exception. The two men stared at each other across the safe house, and Seraphina watched power dynamics shift and settle. This was the cost of the plan. Her father relinquishing control, trusting Lucy Yen, trusting her, trusting that they wouldn't actually get him killed. They staged the death at 10 p.m. in Roman's private study at the Vale estate. Elena's team handled the details with clinical efficiency that made Seraphina wonder how many times they'd done this before. The body, the blood spatter, the ransacked safe, everything designed to look like a daughter who'd finally snapped and taken what she thought she deserved. The actual Roman Vale was already 50 miles north in a compound that didn't exist on any official map. Seraphina stood in her father's study, surrounded by theatrical violence, and felt nothing. No guilt, no fear. Just cold calculation and the certainty that this was the only move that made sense. Lucien found her there at midnight. The crime scene investigators are on their way. You need to be gone before they arrive. I know. You sure you can sell this? Watch me. They called a meeting of the family's highest-ranking members for dawn. Invitation only. Mandatory attendance. The kind of summons that everyone knew meant something catastrophic had happened. Seraphina arrived wearing black in her father's blood. Stage blood, but nobody would know the difference in the dim lighting. She stood at the head of the conference table where Roman had sat for 20 years and looked at men 3 times her age with expressions that ranged from shock to fury. Roman Vale is dead, she said without preamble. I killed him last night. The room exploded. 3 men stood immediately. 2 reached for weapons they'd been required to check at the door. Someone shouted something about betrayal, and another voice called for her arrest, and the chaos was so complete that Seraphina had to slam her hand on the table to restore order. Sit down, she said. Her voice carried an edge she'd learned from her father and sharpened through every hard lesson since Seattle. Or leave. Your choice. Nobody moved. Roman Vale was a liability, she continued. Too traditional, too loyal to outdated codes. He was holding this family back from opportunities that would have made us untouchable. So I did what needed to be done. You murdered your own father, someone said. The voice belonged to Carlo Messina, one of Roman's oldest friends. For what? Power? For survival. The world is changing. Families that don't adapt get consumed. I'm not letting that happen to us. You're insane. I'm necessary. She laid out the plan she and Lucien had constructed. Modernization, expansion into territories Roman had considered too risky, partnerships with families her father had refused to negotiate with, A complete restructuring of the Vale operations with her at the head, and Lucienne providing the Darko resources to make it happen. Half the room looked mutinous. The other half looked intrigued. "The alliance with the Darko stands," she said. "Stronger now because we're unified under leadership that understands what this business actually requires. Anyone who can't accept that is free to leave. But understand," her voice went cold. "If you walk out that door, you're walking away from the only family that can protect you in what's coming." "What's coming?" Carlo demanded. "War. Someone's been moving against us for months, infiltrating our security, manipulating our operations. They wanted this alliance destroyed. Instead, they've given us exactly what we needed, a reason to consolidate power and eliminate anyone who isn't committed to survival." She let that sink in. Watched men who'd known her since she was a child recalculate everything they thought they knew about Roman Vale's daughter. "You have 24 hours to decide," Seraphina said. "You're either with the new regime or you're a problem that gets solved." The meeting ended with silence that felt like a bomb waiting to detonate. Lucienne found her in the parking garage afterward. She was shaking, adrenaline crash hitting hard now that the performance was over. "You were terrifying," he said. Almost sounded impressed. "I was acting." "Were you?" Seraphina didn't have an answer for that. The news spread through Manhattan's underworld like wildfire. By noon, every family knew that Seraphina Vale had killed her father. By evening, the power structure was fracturing in real time. Some supported her. Most called for blood. The Marchetti family in Philadelphia issued a statement that was barely coded threat. The Kozlov family in Brooklyn moved troops into contested territory. 3 smaller operations declared independence from the Vale Syndicate entirely. And somewhere in the chaos, whoever was orchestrating this whole operation watched and waited for their moment to strike. It came at 3 a.m. in the form of Elena bursting into the safe house with blood on her face and panic in her eyes. "They took him," she gasped. Lucienne was on his feet instantly. "Who?" "Roman. Someone hit the upstate compound, killed 4 guards, grabbed him and vanished." Seraphina's blood went ice cold. "How? That location was locked down." Someone knew exactly where he was, which room, which guards were on duty. They walked in like they had blueprints and an invitation. The implication was a knife twisting in Seraphina's gut. "We have another leak," Lucienne said flatly. "Worse than that." Elena pulled up her phone. "They sent a message, to you specifically." She handed the phone to Seraphina. The text was short, brutal, devastating in its simplicity. "Thank you for doing exactly what we needed. Roman Vale is ours now. Your alliance is fracturing. Both families are at war with themselves. In 72 hours, we'll release proof that his death was staged and that you've been manipulating everyone. Then we'll kill him for real. And everyone will blame you for destroying the only man who could have held this world together. You played your part perfectly. Someone who's been 10 steps ahead since the moment you ran to Seattle." The phone slipped from Seraphina's hands. Everything crystallized in that moment with perfect, horrible clarity. The blackmail. Victor's death. The demand to kill her father. Her plan to fake his death and flush out their enemies. All of it had been orchestrated. They'd never been hunting the puppet master. They'd been dancing on strings the entire time. And now Roman Vale, the one person with enough power and respect to potentially stop whatever was coming, was in the hands of someone who'd been planning this since before Seraphina ever ran away. Since Seattle, since Nolan. She looked at Lucienne and watched him reach the same conclusion she had. "They knew I'd come back," she whispered. "Knew I'd agree to the marriage. Knew exactly what I'd do when threatened. This whole thing was a trap designed specifically for you." The safe house felt very small suddenly, very exposed. Seraphina's breathing came too fast. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Everything she'd done in the past 3 days, every choice she'd thought was taking control, had been exactly what someone wanted her to do. She'd announced to the entire underworld that she'd killed her father, created chaos in both families, weakened their position precisely when they needed to be strongest. And now the man she'd been trying to protect was going to be murdered for real, while everyone believed she'd already killed him. "We need to find him," she said. "Now." "We don't even know who has him," Elena replied, "or how many people they've compromised. For all we know, half the people we trust are working for them." "Then we don't trust anyone." "That's not a plan. That's paranoia. Paranoia's been right so far. Lucian grabbed her shoulders, forced her to look at him. Breathe. We figure this out, but we do it smart. There's no time for smart. They said 72 hours, which means they're giving us time to panic, to make mistakes. We don't give them that satisfaction. But Seraphina was already spiraling. 3 days of pressure, of violence, of discovering that every choice she'd made had been anticipated by someone who knew her better than she knew herself. Someone who'd been watching since Seattle. The thought stopped her cold. Nolan, she said. What about him? The message said they've been ahead since Seattle. Nolan was hired to find me, to get close. What if... Her voice shook. What if he wasn't working for the Marchettis? What if he was working for whoever's doing this the whole time? Lucian's expression went very dark. You think Pierce is involved? I think he's the only person who knew enough about me to predict exactly how I'd react to everything that's happened. Elena was already typing. Last known location was Hell's Kitchen, the hotel where you met him. He's not there anymore, Seraphina said with certainty. He's wherever my father is. Or he knows who has him. Then we find him. How? He could be anywhere. No. Lucien's voice carried the cold calculation that had built the Darko Empire. He could be anywhere you'd look for him, which means we figure out where you wouldn't look and start there. Seraphina closed her eyes. Thought about Nolan, about 18 months in Seattle, about every conversation and every lie and every moment she'd thought she'd known him. Where would he go that she wouldn't think to look? The answer hit her like physical impact. The courthouse, she whispered. What? Where we got married the first time. He was sentimental about it, kept talking about how it was the only real thing we'd ever done together. If he's part of this, if he's been playing me the entire time, he'd go back there. Some twisted sense of poetry. It was thin, maybe desperate, but it was the only thread they had. We go now, Lucian said. But we go prepared for this to be exactly what they want us to do. They left the safe house with 4 vehicles and enough weapons to start a small war. Elena drove while Seraphina sat in the back, trying not to think about all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. The courthouse was closed at 4 a.m., empty, the kind of institutional building that looked haunted after hours. They parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot through shadows that felt like they were crawling with surveillance. The side entrance had been forced open. Recently, the metal still bent from whatever tool had been used. Lucian signaled his team into position. They moved through the building with the kind of coordinated silence that came from training and experience and the certainty that one wrong move meant death. The courtroom where Seraphina and Nolan had been married was on the 3rd floor. They found him there. Nolan sat in the same spot where he'd stood 18 months ago, promising to love her forever. He wasn't alone. 2 men flanked him with weapons that looked military grade, and in the center of the room, tied to a chair with blood running from a cut above his eye, Roman Vale. Seraphina's father looked up when they entered, and the expression on his face was something between relief and absolute fury. "Nice of you to show up," he said. His voice was rough but steady. "Dad?" "Save it." Nolan stood. He looked different, harder, the charming architect performance completely gone. "You're right on schedule." Lucien's team aimed weapons. Nolan's people did the same, Mexican standoff in a courthouse after midnight, while everything Seraphina had tried to save collapsed around her. "Let him go," she said. "Why would I do that? We're finally at the interesting part. This was you, the entire time, Seattle, the blackmail, everything. Not just me. But yes, I played my part beautifully. Got you to fall in love, got you to run back home, got you to marry Lucien and fake your father's death and destroy your own credibility. All exactly as planned." "Why?" Nolan smiled. It was nothing like the smiles he'd given her in Seattle. This was sharp, cruel, the expression of someone who'd won a game she hadn't known she was playing. Because Roman Vale and Thomas Darko represent the old world, the one where loyalty and honor actually meant something. That world is dying, and someone needs to be in position to take control when it finally collapses. Someone meaning you? Someone meaning the people I actually work for. Who? But before Nolan could answer, the doors behind them exploded inward and Seraphina's world came apart for the final time. Thomas Darko walked into the courtroom with 20 armed men and an expression that made Lucien's blood drain from his face. "Hello, son," he said quietly. "We need to talk about your extremely poor choice in wives." And Seraphina understood, finally, horrifyingly, exactly how deep this went. The person who'd been orchestrating everything wasn't some external enemy. It was Lucien's own father, the man who'd arranged their marriage in the first place, who'd built this trap specifically for both their families, who'd been waiting for exactly this moment to reveal that the alliance had never been real. Just bait to expose every weakness before moving in for the kill. The silence in that courtroom lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like watching the world end in slow motion. Thomas Darko stood surrounded by enough firepower to level the building. His suit was immaculate. His expression was calm, the kind of calm that came from knowing you'd already won and were just waiting for everyone else to catch up. Lucien's face had gone absolutely white. "Father," he said. His voice was steady, but Seraphina could hear the fracture underneath. "What are you doing?" "Cleaning up a mess that's been festering for 20 years. Thomas walked further into the courtroom like he owned it. Maybe he did. Maybe he owned all of this. The building, the city, the empire they'd thought they were building together. "Roman, you look terrible." Roman Vale spat blood onto the floor. "Go to hell, Thomas." "Probably, but not today." Thomas nodded at Nolan. "Cut him loose." Nolan moved to obey and Seraphina watched the dynamic shift into something even more horrifying. Nolan Pierce wasn't working for the Marchettis or some external threat. He was working for her father-in-law, for the man who'd arranged her marriage, who'd welcomed her into the Darko family with speeches about partnership and unity and building something stronger together. All of it lies. "You orchestrated everything," Seraphina said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Seattle, Nolan, the blackmail, Victor, all of it. Not quite everything. You running away to Seattle was your own choice. Admirably dramatic, actually. But yes, once you left, I saw an opportunity." Thomas smiled. It was worse than Nolan's had been. Fatherly, almost. "You wanted freedom from your father's empire. I gave you Nolan. Someone charming enough to make you believe you could be normal. Someone who'd hurt you badly enough that you'd come running home ready to embrace exactly what you'd been running from. You manipulated her into coming back," Lucien said. His hand had moved toward his weapon, but Thomas's men tracked the motion with raised rifles. "I created optimal conditions for her return. There's a difference." "Like hell there is." "Don't be naive, son. This business runs on leverage. I needed Seraphina angry, hardened, ready to become the weapon her bloodline promised she could be. Emma Russo serving noodles in Seattle wasn't useful to anyone, but Seraphina Vale seeking revenge?" Thomas gestured at her. Now that had potential. Roman had gotten to his feet, hands freed from the chair but still cable-tied together. Blood ran down his temple and into his collar. "You used my daughter as bait. I used your daughter as catalyst. The marriage to Lucien was real, legally binding, strategically sound. I genuinely believed an alliance would strengthen both families." Thomas pulled out a cigarette, lit it despite the no-smoking signs plastered everywhere. "What I didn't account for was how inconveniently loyal you both would remain to outdated concepts like honor and restraint." "So you decided to burn it all down," Elena said from somewhere near the door. Her weapon was up, but the math was bad, 20 guns against 4. "I decided to rebuild it properly. You all keep clinging to the old rules, the ones that say you don't kill family. You honor your word. You maintain territories and respect boundaries." Thomas exhaled smoke. "Those rules are why we're dying. Why younger, hungrier organizations are eating our market share. Why federal investigators keep getting closer. The old world is burning and you're all trying to save it with buckets of water. And your solution is patricide?" Lucien's voice had gone very quiet. "Destroying your own son's marriage? Kidnapping your closest ally?" "My solution is evolution. Roman and I built empires based on 20th century power structures. You two," he gestured at Lucien and Seraphina, "you represent something new. Ruthless enough to do what's necessary, smart enough to adapt. You proved that by faking Roman's death and seizing control." "That was to flush you out," Seraphina said. "And it worked beautifully. You played exactly the part I needed, the daughter willing to kill her father for power. Do you understand what message that sends to every family watching this alliance? That the new generation doesn't recognize the old rules anymore. The pieces were clicking together in Seraphina's head. Each one felt like swallowing glass. You wanted us to look like monsters, she said slowly, to discredit ourselves. So when we actually took control, no one would trust you. No one would follow you. Both families would fracture into factions. And in that chaos, Thomas smiled again. Someone with credibility and resources could step in, unite the pieces under new leadership, my leadership. You're insane, Roman said. I'm practical. You and I are relics, old friend. We had our time. Now it's our children's turn, except they need to understand something first. Thomas walked closer to Lucian. Power isn't inherited, it's taken. And it only belongs to people willing to make the hardest choices. Like what? Lucian's jaw was so tight it looked painful. Betraying your own family? Like understanding that family is a tool, a weapon. The moment you start believing it's sacred is the moment you become weak. Thomas turned to Seraphina. Your father taught you that, didn't he? In his own way. Why do you think he arranged your engagement before you ran? He knew you'd never choose this life voluntarily, so he tried to force it, control you through obligation. He was protecting me. He was using you. Same as I'm using Lucian. Same as everyone in this business uses everyone else. The only difference is honesty about it. Seraphina looked at her father. Roman's face was bleeding and bruised, but his eyes were clear, furious. When he spoke, his voice carried an edge that made Thomas's men shift nervously. The difference, Thomas, is that I actually love my daughter. You just see assets. Love is a liability. Love is what's going to destroy you. Thomas laughed. Touching, useless, but touching. Unfortunately, we're past the point of speeches about family values. He nodded at his men. Take Roman to the car. Lucien and Seraphina come with me. Everyone else... He looked at Elena and the Darko security team with something close to pity. You're witnessing a regime change. You can be part of the new structure, or you can be buried under it. Your choice. The math started shifting. 3 of Lucien's men lowered their weapons. Then 2 more. Seraphina watched loyalty fracture in real time as people made calculations about survival versus principle. Elena kept her gun up. Lucien? Don't, Lucian said quietly. Stand down. Like hell. That's an order. Elena's face twisted, but she lowered her weapon. The remaining security followed. Thomas's men moved in immediately, disarming everyone, securing the room, turning a standoff into a controlled surrender. Seraphina's hands were zip-tied behind her back. Lucien received the same treatment. They were shoved toward the door while Thomas supervised like a director watching his masterpiece come together. Where are you taking us? Seraphina demanded. Somewhere private, where we can have a real conversation about the future. And after that? Thomas met her eyes. After that, you announced to the underworld that your father's death was real, that you've taken control of the Vale operations with my blessing and support. Lucian will confirm the Darko family is united behind this transition. Together, we'll present a unified front while I consolidate actual control behind the scenes. And if we refuse, then Roman dies for real, messily, publicly. And I release evidence that you two staged his death as part of a coup attempt. Every family loyal to him will hunt you. The FBI will have everything they need to indict you both. Your alliance becomes a criminal conspiracy instead of a marriage. Thomas opened the door. You'll do what I ask because the alternative is watching everything burn while you're buried under it. They were walked out through the side entrance where 6 vehicles waited. Roman was shoved into one. Seraphina and Lucien were separated. Different cars, different guards, no way to communicate. Seraphina caught Lucien's eye as they were pushed apart. His expression was unreadable, but she saw calculation there. Planning. He wasn't beaten yet. Neither was she. The car she was shoved into smelled like leather and gunpowder. 2 guards flanked her. Thomas sat in front looking relaxed and completely in control. You're angry, he said without turning around. That's good. Anger is useful. You betrayed your own son. I'm teaching him the most important lesson of his life. That sentiment is weakness. That trust is a liability, that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself. That's a lonely way to live. That's survival. They drove through Manhattan in pre-dawn darkness. The city looked different from behind zip-tied hands, less like empire, more like prison. Seraphina's wrists were already raw from pulling against the plastic. Her mind raced through options and exit strategies and increasingly desperate scenarios. She had nothing. No weapon. No backup. No leverage except whatever she could create in the next few minutes before Thomas took her somewhere she couldn't escape from. "Where's Nolan now?" she asked. "Why? Missing him?" Curious how deep his involvement goes. Thomas glanced back. Nolan Pierce was a useful tool, played his part well, got paid handsomely. He's already on a plane to somewhere without extradition treaties. You let him go. His usefulness expired the moment you came home. Keeping him around would have been sentimental. I don't do sentimental. No, you just destroy families and call it business strategy. I prefer to think of it as natural selection. The car turned into an industrial area near the waterfront. Warehouses and shipping containers. The kind of place where screams wouldn't travel and bodies disappeared into the East River without investigation. Seraphina's heart rate kicked up. This was bad. This was the place where negotiations ended and violence began. They pulled her from the car into a warehouse that echoed with emptiness. Roman was already there, shoved to his knees in the center of the concrete floor. Lucien was brought in seconds later looking pale but controlled. Thomas stood between them like a conductor preparing for a symphony. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to call a meeting of both families. Announce that Roman's death was staged to flush out threats to the alliance. That I helped coordinate this operation. That moving forward, all major decisions go through me as senior counsel to the new regime." "No," Roman said. "I'm sorry. I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly. And the answer is no." Thomas pulled a weapon from his jacket. Casual, almost bored. He pointed it at Roman's head and Seraphina's entire body went rigid. "Dad!" "He's not going to shoot me," Roman said calmly. "If he kills me for real, he loses the leverage that makes this plan work. Dead martyr is worse for him than living hostage." Thomas's expression flickered. "You're betting your life on that assessment." "I've been betting my life on worse odds for 40 years. "Then let's test those odds." Thomas swung the weapon toward Seraphina. "Maybe I don't need Roman alive. Maybe I just need his daughter cooperative." Time crystallized. Seraphina stared down the barrel of a gun held by her father-in-law while Lucien made a sound that was almost animal, and Roman went absolutely still. "Hurt her," Roman said quietly. "And I don't care what it costs me. I'll burn your empire to the ground." "You'll be dead." "I have people loyal enough to carry out final instructions. You know that." The standoff stretched between them. Thomas's finger on the trigger. Roman's face carved from stone. Seraphina's breath coming too fast while her mind raced through increasingly desperate mathematics. Then Lucian spoke. "I'll do it." Everyone turned. "I'll announce the new structure," Lucian continued. His voice was steady, but his eyes looked haunted. "I'll tell both families that you're the senior authority moving forward. I'll say whatever you need me to say." "Lucien, no," Seraphina started. "In exchange," he continued, talking over her, "you let them go. Both of them. Seraphina and Roman walk out of here untouched. They disappear. You get the empire. I stay and help you run it, but they're off limits. Permanently." Thomas studied his son like he was a math problem with an unexpected solution. "You'd give up everything? Your wife? Your alliance? Your own power base? To keep them alive?" "Yes." "That's weakness, son. That's the deal. Take it or I'll make this so difficult for you that burning it all down starts looking reasonable." The silence in that warehouse felt like suffocation. Seraphina wanted to scream, wanted to throw herself between Lucien and this catastrophic sacrifice. But her hands were still tied and guards still flanked her and the gun was still pointed at her head. Thomas lowered the weapon slowly. "Interesting," he said. "You actually care about her. I thought that was performance." "You thought wrong. I must be getting sentimental in my old age." Thomas gestured at his men. "Cut them loose. Roman and Seraphina leave. Now." "No," Seraphina said. "I'm not leaving him. You are." Lucien looked at her, and his expression was something between apology and command. You're leaving because if you stay, he'll use you to control both of us, and I need you free to do what comes next. What comes next? You'll figure it out. You're smarter than all of us. A guard cut the zip ties binding her wrists. Another did the same for Roman. Seraphina stood on shaking legs while her father-in-law watched like this was dinner theater instead of the collapse of everything they'd built. You have 1 hour, Thomas said. After that, I announce the new structure with or without your cooperation. If either of you try anything stupid, Lucien pays for it. Understood? Roman grabbed Seraphina's arm, pulled her toward the door before she could argue or fight or do anything except stumble after him into the pre-dawn air. They were shoved into a car driven by one of Thomas's people, drove in silence back toward Manhattan, while Seraphina's mind spun through scenarios so desperate they felt like drowning. We have to go back, she said. We can't. Dad, he's your son-in-law. He's a hostage and a target. If we go back now, Thomas kills all three of us. Roman pulled out a phone he'd somehow kept hidden. We have one shot at this. At what? Turning Thomas's own strategy against him. He made 3 calls in rapid succession, each one quiet, coded, the kind of communication that didn't leave trails. By the time they reached the Vale estate, dawn was breaking and Seraphina could see pieces moving on a chessboard she didn't fully understand yet. What did you do? She asked. Called in every favor I've been saving for 40 years. Reached out to families that hate Thomas more than they hate me. Offered them something Thomas can never give them. What's that? A chance to prove loyalty still matters in this business. The Vale estate erupted with activity. Men Seraphina didn't recognize arrived in unmarked vehicles. Weapons were distributed. Battle plans were drawn up on maps that looked military grade. Her father transformed from hostage to general in the space of an hour. Elena showed up at 7 a.m. looking like she'd fought through hell to get there. The Darko family is fracturing, she reported. Half of them are loyal to Thomas. The other half think he's insane for what he did to Lucien. It's chaos. Good, Roman said. Chaos is what we need. What's the play? We hit Thomas before he can consolidate. He's got Lucien at the warehouse. Probably thinks we're running scared or planning something that'll take days to organize. He's wrong. You want to assault that location? Elena looked at the maps. It's fortified. He's got 20 men minimum, maybe more. We'll have 40. That's still a bloodbath. Yes, it is. Seraphina stood at the edge of the planning session, feeling like she was watching a war start in real time. This wasn't strategy meetings and polite negotiations anymore. This was the part where people died, where the empire her father had built was about to burn down or be reborn in blood. I'm coming with you, she said. Roman looked up sharply. Absolutely not. He's my husband. I'm not sitting here while you fight my war. Seraphina, you taught me this business. Taught me that power matters more than safety, that sometimes you have to make the hard choices. Well, this is my choice. I go, or I'll find my own way there and get killed doing something stupid. Her father studied her face. She could see him calculating, weighing her life against her agency, against the reality that she'd stopped being the girl who ran to Seattle somewhere in the past week. You follow orders, he said finally. Every single one. No heroics, no improvisation. Clear? Clear. And if this goes badly, then we all go down together, as family. Roman's expression softened for just a moment. Your mother would be so proud and so furious. Yeah, I get that from both of you. They moved at 9 a.m. Convoy of vehicles loaded with men who'd spent their lives doing violence for the Vale family. Seraphina rode in the lead car wearing tactical gear that felt like costume and carrying a weapon she'd only fired at a range twice. Her hands shook. Elena sat beside her. First time? That obvious? You're breathing too fast. Slow it down or you'll hyperventilate before we even arrive. Seraphina forced herself to breathe slower, to think, to remember every lesson her father had tried to teach her before she'd run away. Violence wasn't personal. It was mechanical. You aimed. You fired. You didn't think about the person on the other end because thinking got you killed. She'd crossed the line with Marcus Delgado, with Nolan, with every choice that had brought her to this moment. One more line wouldn't matter, except it would, because the person she was trying to save was someone who'd actually chosen her, who'd sacrificed his own freedom to keep her alive, who'd become something more than a strategic marriage somewhere between the courthouse and this morning. The warehouse appeared through morning fog, like something out of a nightmare. Thomas's vehicles were still there, guards visible on the perimeter. It looked exactly like the kind of place where rescue attempts went catastrophically wrong. "Final chance to stay in the car," Roman said. "Not happening." "Then stay behind me, and if I tell you to run, I won't." "Seraphina, you don't get to protect me anymore, Dad." "That stopped being your job when I married Lucian." Something passed between them, understanding maybe, or just acceptance that his daughter had grown into someone who made her own choices, even when those choices led straight into gunfire. They hit the warehouse like a hurricane. Roman's men poured through 3 entrances simultaneously. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the enclosed space, flashes of muzzle fire lighting up shadows. Seraphina stayed low, moved like Elena had instructed, tried not to think about the bodies dropping around her. Thomas's people had been expecting an eventual response, but not this soon. Not this organized. The fighting was brutal and close quarters, and over in minutes that felt like hours. Seraphina pushed through smoke and noise toward the center of the warehouse where she'd last seen Lucian. Found him still tied to a chair looking battered, but alive. Their eyes met across carnage, and she watched relief crash across his face. "You came back," he said. "Of course I came back." She cut him loose with a knife someone had given her. "Did you think I'd leave you here? I hoped you'd be smart enough to run." "Yeah, well, I'm learning to be stupid in all the right ways." He stood on unsteady legs, pulled her close despite the chaos around them. "My father is about to learn why loyalty still matters." They found Thomas near the back exit trying to escape through a loading bay. Roman cut off his retreat with 5 men and enough weapons to end this immediately. Thomas turned slowly, hands raised, gun dropping from his grip. For the first time since walking into that courthouse, he looked old, surprised, like he genuinely believed his plan couldn't fail. "Roman," he said carefully, "we can negotiate." "No, we really can't. I did what I thought was necessary. You betrayed everything we built, used our children as weapons, tried to burn down 40 years of empire because you were too arrogant to accept that the world was changing with or without your permission." Thomas looked at Lucien, at Seraphina. His expression shifted through calculations before settling on something that might have been regret. "I taught you to be strong," he said to his son. "No," Lucien replied quietly. "You taught me what happens when power matters more than everything else, and I'm choosing different." "That's weakness. That's evolution, the real kind, not your version." Roman raised his weapon and Seraphina watched her father prepare to execute his oldest friend, the man who'd stood beside him for decades, who'd helped build the empire, who'd crossed the one line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Wait," she said. Everyone turned. "Let him live." Roman's expression was incredulous. "Seraphina, I mean it. Let him live, stripped of power, under house arrest for the rest of his life. Let him watch what we build without him. That's worse than death for someone like him." Thomas looked at her like she'd just said something either merciful or cruelly brilliant. Maybe both. "The girl who ran away wouldn't have suggested that," he said. "I'm not that girl anymore. You made sure of it." Roman lowered his weapon slowly, looked at his daughter with an expression that carried pride and concern in equal measure. "House arrest," he said finally. "Monitored 24 hours. One wrong move and the deal's void." Thomas was dragged away by guards who'd been his own men hours ago. The warehouse cleared. Bodies were handled with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. Evidence disappeared. By noon, it would look like nothing had happened here except maybe some kids breaking in to drink. Seraphina and Lucien stood in the emptying warehouse while morning sun filtered through broken skylights. "So," he said, "we're still married. Legally, barely. And the alliance? Depends. You want to actually try this? For real this time?" Lucien looked at her carefully. "No more lies? No more lies. No more games? Only the ones we play together." He smiled. It was exhausted and bloody and probably the most honest expression she'd seen from him. "Yeah, I want to try." They walked out of that warehouse hand in hand while Manhattan woke up to a new empire. One built on survival instead of strategy, on choice instead of obligation, on two people who'd been weaponized against each other and decided to become weapons aimed in the same direction instead. But as they reached the car, Seraphina's phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then something made her check the message. What she saw made her blood run cold. A photo, taken that morning, of her and Lucien leaving the courthouse before the assault, and a caption that destroyed everything. Smile for the cameras. Every federal agency in New York just watched you storm a building with 40 armed men. You won the war. Now you get to fight the system. The real game starts now. Someone who's been recording everything. Seraphina looked at Lucien, at her father, at the empire they'd just saved through violence and sacrifice, and choices that couldn't be unmade. And she realized Thomas had been right about one thing. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much more dangerous game. One where the federal investigation hit them like a freight train wrapped in legal paperwork and surveillance footage that shouldn't have existed. Seraphina sat in a conference room at the FBI field office in Lower Manhattan, watching grainy video of herself entering that warehouse with 40 armed men. The timestamp read 9:07 a.m. The angle suggested drone footage or satellite surveillance. Either way, it was damning. Special Agent Rebecca Chen sat across the table with a file thick enough to be a weapon. Mid-40s, sharp suit, the kind of expression that said she'd seen every variety of criminal and wasn't impressed by any of them. "You want to tell me what happened at that warehouse?" Chen asked. "I want a lawyer." "Smart. You'll need one." Chen slid a photograph across the table. Thomas Darko being dragged from the building by Roman Vale's men. "We've been building a RICO case against your family for 3 years, and now you've handed us everything we need wrapped in a bow." Seraphina's hands were steady on the table. No cuffs yet. They were still in the voluntary questioning phase where cooperation might mean the difference between 20 years and life. But her lawyer was 20 minutes away, and every word she said before he arrived could be used to destroy what was left of the empire. So she said nothing, just stared at Agent Chen and waited. "Your father's in the next room," Chen continued. "So's your husband. Thomas Darko's in protective custody, singing like it's his last performance. You know what he's telling us?" Silence. "That you orchestrated a fake death to seize control of your father's operations. That you tortured a man named Marcus Delgado before he disappeared. That you've been laundering money through Darko shipping routes for months." Chen leaned forward. "He's offering you up as the mastermind in exchange for a reduced sentence." Seraphina felt ice slide through her veins. Thomas was doing exactly what she should have expected, saving himself by sacrificing everyone else, painting her as the ambitious daughter who'd manipulated 2 families into war just to grab power. It was almost believable. "I'm not saying anything without counsel present," Seraphina repeated. "Your call. But understand something. We've got footage, financial records, witness testimony. The only question is whether you go down alone or you cooperate, and maybe we find a way to make this survivable." The door opened and Seraphina's lawyer walked in. Gerald Moss. 60 years old, $3,000 suit, the kind of attorney who'd gotten senators out of treason charges. Roman had him on retainer for exactly this scenario. "My client has nothing to say," Moss announced before he'd even sat down. Chen smiled without warmth. "Then she can say it from a cell while we process her arrest." "On what charges specifically?" "Conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, money laundering, assault with a deadly weapon. Should I continue? Arrest her or release her? You don't get to fish for cooperation through intimidation." The standoff lasted 10 seconds before Chen stood and signaled to agents waiting outside. Seraphina felt handcuffs close around her wrists for the second time in a week. This time there was no zip ties or criminal theatrics, just cold metal and the weight of federal authority. "Seraphina Vale Darko," Chen said formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit racketeering and murder. You have the right to remain silent." The rest of the Miranda warning faded into background noise while Seraphina was processed through a system designed to break people. Fingerprints, photographs, a holding cell that smelled like disinfectant and desperation. She sat on the concrete bench and counted her breathing, tried not to think about Lucien in another cell somewhere in this building, about her father facing the same charges, about Thomas's betrayal stacking on top of every other betrayal until the weight felt like drowning. The door opened 6 hours later. Moss looked exhausted but grimly satisfied. "They're offering a deal." "What kind of deal?" testify against Thomas Darko, and provide evidence of his operation spanning the past 5 years. Full cooperation. In exchange, they'll drop the conspiracy charges and reduce everything else to probation and time served. And my father, Lucian? Same deals on the table for both of them, separately negotiated. But it means burning Thomas completely. Seraphina thought about Thomas Darko sitting in protective custody, trying to save himself by destroying everyone else. About his speech in the warehouse about loyalty being weakness and sentiment being liability. He taught them that lesson thoroughly. Now they'd teach him what happened when you underestimated the people you tried to sacrifice. I'll testify, she said. The deal came together over 48 hours of negotiation that felt like surgery without anesthesia. Seraphina gave the FBI everything. Financial records showing Thomas's offshore accounts. Communications proving he'd orchestrated Victor's payments. Evidence of his involvement in operations spanning 2 decades that violated about 40 federal statutes. Roman provided the historical context. Lucien filled in the operational details. Together they built a case against Thomas Darko that would bury him under so many charges he'd die in prison before seeing trial. And in exchange, they walked out of federal custody with electronic monitoring anklets and restrictions that would have been unthinkable a month ago but felt like mercy compared to life sentences. Seraphina stood outside the FBI building at dusk, wearing the same clothes she'd been arrested in. Lucien emerged 10 minutes later looking like he'd aged a decade. They didn't speak, just walked to where Elena waited with a car that wasn't armored or equipped with hidden weapons compartments. Just a regular vehicle for people who were about to become very irregular civilians. Your father's at the estate, Elena said as they drove through Manhattan traffic. Asked to see you both as soon as you were released. The Vale estate looked different now, less like empire, more like museum. Federal agents had seized most of the assets pending investigation. The staff had been reduced to essential personnel. The chandeliers still glowed, but the marble halls echoed with emptiness instead of power. Roman sat in his study surrounded by boxes of financial records and legal documents. He looked smaller somehow, older. The weight of 40 years of empire visibly pressing down on shoulders that had always seemed strong enough to carry anything. You're out, he said when they entered. For now. Seraphina sat across from him. They could still change their minds if Thomas's lawyers get creative. Thomas won't have lawyers much longer. His family's cutting him loose. No one wants to be associated with what he did. Good. Silence settled between them. Outside, Manhattan glittered with indifferent beauty. Somewhere in this city, federal prosecutors were building cases. Rival families were circling, the empire was fracturing in real time, and there was nothing any of them could do except watch. I'm sorry, Roman said finally. Seraphina looked up sharply. For what? For building something that required you to become this. For pushing you toward that engagement before Seattle. For not being honest about what this life would cost. His voice cracked slightly. You ran because I was suffocating you, and when you came back I was so relieved I didn't ask what it had cost you to return. Dad, let me finish. Your mother would have seen what I couldn't, that you needed freedom more than protection, that forcing you into this world would break something essential. He looked at her with eyes that suddenly seemed very old. I'm proud of who you've become, and I'm sorry it required so much violence to get here. Seraphina felt her throat close. I made my choices. After I made mine. After I built a world where the only choices available were variations of the same cage. It wasn't just you, Thomas Nolan. Every man who looked at me and saw commodity instead of person. She leaned forward. But I'm not that person anymore. I'm not Emma Russo who believed in love. I'm not the runaway princess who thought she could escape. She paused. I don't know what I am now. You're my daughter, Roman said simply, and you're free. For the first time in your life, you actually get to choose what happens next. The words hung in the air like promise and threat simultaneously. Because freedom was terrifying when you'd spent your whole life in various cages. Seraphina left her father's study and found Lucien on the balcony overlooking the grounds. He stood at the railing smoking a cigarette. He'd probably bummed off one of the remaining security. The ankle monitor glinted in the evening light. Elegant accessory, she said, nodding at the device. Goes with everything, very versatile. She leaned against the railing beside him. What happens now? With us? The families? The fact that we're both wearing federal surveillance and can't leave the state without permission? All of it. Lucian took a drag and exhaled slowly. Honestly, I have no idea. My father destroyed half of what we built. The Fed seized the other half. Most of our operations are either shut down or being investigated. We're technically still married, but I don't know what that means when neither of us has an empire to rule. So we're just, what, ordinary people? I don't think we know how to be ordinary. Seraphina looked at Manhattan sprawling below them. We could learn. Could we? He turns to face her. Be honest. If I wasn't connected to power or family or any of this, if I was just some guy, would you still want me? The question was sharp enough to cut. Seraphina thought about courthouse vows with Nolan, about believing love could exist outside of strategy, about learning the hard way that every relationship carried calculation whether you acknowledged it or not. I don't know, she said finally, but I know I want to find out. That's not a ringing endorsement. It's honest, which is more than we've had most of this marriage. Lucian studied her face like he was seeing her for the first time. You terrify me sometimes. Good, you should be scared of me. No, I mean, you make me want things I didn't think I was capable of wanting, like actual partnership, like building something that isn't just transaction and survival. He stubbed out the cigarette. That's more frightening than anything my father did. Why? Because wanting things makes you vulnerable, and we just spent a week learning exactly what happens to vulnerable people in our world. Seraphina took his hand. Then maybe we build a different world, one where vulnerability isn't weakness. You think that's possible? I think we've done impossible things already. This might just be the hardest one. They stood together while the city noise drifted up, sirens and traffic, and the endless hum of millions of people living lives that had nothing to do with empires or crime or federal investigations. Normal people, ordinary struggles. Maybe that was the real evolution Thomas had been too arrogant to see. Not discarding loyalty for power, but choosing to be human instead of weapon. The trial started 3 months later. Thomas Darko sat in federal court wearing prison orange instead of designer suits. His legal team was competent, but outmatched by the combined weight of 3 cooperating witnesses and 40 years of documented crimes. Seraphina testified for 6 hours, walked the jury through Thomas's plan, the manipulation, the violence, every calculated move designed to destroy the alliance from within. When the prosecutor asked why she'd participated in faking her father's death, Seraphina looked directly at Thomas and said, "Because I believe the man who arranged my marriage was actually trying to protect us. I was wrong." The jury deliberated for 8 hours, guilty on all counts. Thomas Darko was sentenced to life without parole in a federal supermax facility where he'd spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. No visitors, no contact with the outside world, just silence and concrete, and the rest of his life to think about the empire he'd destroyed through arrogance. Seraphina watched him get led away in chains and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no closure, just the hollow certainty that some victories cost more than they were worth. The Vale and Darko families fractured completely after the trial. Half went legitimate, using their legal businesses and political connections to build something that didn't require violence. The other half scattered into smaller operations that the federal government was already targeting for the next round of prosecutions. The empire Roman and Thomas had built was gone, dismantled piece by piece through investigations and defections and the simple reality that the old world was dying whether anyone liked it or not. Roman Vale retired to a house upstate under witness protection protocols. He called Seraphina once a week. They talked about weather and books and everything except the past. It was stilted and strange, and maybe the most honest relationship they'd ever had. Seraphina and Lucian moved into a brownstone in Brooklyn that had no security cameras or panic rooms or hidden weapons caches. Just old hardwood floors and neighbors who had no idea they were living next to people who'd testified in one of the biggest RICO cases in federal history. The ankle monitors came off after a year. Seraphina started taking business classes at NYU, real ones, about marketing and management and strategies that didn't involve violence. Lucian worked with a nonprofit helping formerly incarcerated people reintegrate into society. It was bizarre and humbling and sometimes almost funny how poorly equipped they were for normal life. But they learned. 2 years after walking out of that warehouse, Seraphina stood in their kitchen making coffee while morning light filtered through windows that weren't bulletproof. Lucien was at the table reviewing applications for the nonprofit's leadership program. They'd developed routines, small rhythms, the kind of ordinary intimacy that had nothing to do with strategy. "You remember the courthouse?" Lucien asked suddenly. "Which time?" "We've had a lot of courthouse experiences. The first time, before everything, when we agreed this was going to be business partnership and nothing more." "Yeah, I remember." "Did you believe it then? That we could actually do that?" Seraphina thought about Emma Russo and Nolan Pierce and every version of herself she'd been and discarded. "I believed it was the safest option, honesty without expectations. And now I think we were both lying. We wanted it to be safe. But somewhere between the performance and the violence we actually became," she paused, "I don't know what to call it. Partners? More than that. Friends? Closer." Lucien smiled. "You're really bad at emotional vocabulary." "I'm learning. Give me another decade." He stood and crossed to where she was standing, pulled her close in a way that was comfortable and familiar and earned through fire. "I love you," he said quietly. "I know that's complicated given how this started, but it's true." Seraphina rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady and real, and nothing like the calculated affection she'd experienced with Nolan. "I love you too," she said finally. "And yes, it's complicated, but most things worth having are." They stood in their kitchen while Brooklyn woke up around them. No empires, no violence, no federal agents watching from surveillance vans. Just two people who'd survived the worst versions of themselves and chosen to build something better from the wreckage. That afternoon, Seraphina received a letter. No return address. Postmarked from somewhere in South America. She opened it at the kitchen table while Lucien made dinner. Inside was a single photograph. Nolan Pierce on a beach somewhere tropical. Sunglasses. Tourist shirt. The kind of anonymous retirement bought with blood money and successful cons. The note was handwritten. "Seraphina, I know you're probably wondering why I'm sending this. Truth is, I don't entirely know myself. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's just the weird human need to explain ourselves even when explanation doesn't change anything. I did care about you in Seattle. Not the way you deserved, not without the calculation. But some part of me that wasn't entirely acting saw something in you that made me want to be better. I took Thomas's money anyway. Did what he asked. Hurt you in ways I knew would drive you exactly where he wanted you to go. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. Just wanted you to know that the girl I met in that noodle shop, Emma Russo, she was real to me in ways nothing else has been before or since. I hope you built something better than what we had. Hope you're free." Nolan Seraphina read it twice. Then she walked to the stove, held the letter over the flame, and watched it burn. Lucien glanced over. "What was that?" "Nothing important, just someone who doesn't exist anymore." "Like us?" "No, we existed. We just evolved." She threw the ashes in the trash and washed her hands. Let Nolan Pierce disappear into whatever life he'd built from betrayal and regret. Some stories didn't need closure, they just needed to be finished. That evening, Seraphina and Lucien walked through Prospect Park while autumn leaves scattered across paths worn smooth by thousands of ordinary footsteps. They held hands like normal people, talked about mundane things, groceries and weekend plans, and whether they should finally get a dog. "You ever miss it?" Lucien asked. "The power, the feeling that you could move pieces on a board and watch the whole city shift. Sometimes. Usually in the middle of the night when I can't sleep and ordinary life feels suffocating." She squeezed his hand, but then I remember what it cost, who I had to become, and I think maybe being ordinary is the most radical thing we could have chosen. That's very philosophical. I've had a lot of therapy. Fair point. They stopped at a bench overlooking the lake. Ducks drifted across water that reflected evening sky. Somewhere in the distance, children played and couples argued, and life continued with complete indifference to empires rising and falling. "You know what Emma Russo wanted?" Seraphina said quietly. "What?" "Exactly this. Ordinary moment with someone who chose her for reasons that had nothing to do with leverage or family or strategic advantage." She looked at Lucien. "She would have liked you. The real you, not the performance. Think she would have forgiven me for the first version? Probably not immediately, but eventually. Seraphina leaned against him. She understood that people were complicated, that someone could hurt you and still be worth saving. Is that what we're doing? Saving each other? Maybe. Or maybe we're just learning how to be human after spending our whole lives being weapons. They sat until the park lights came on and the temperature dropped enough that they needed the jackets they'd forgotten in the car. Walking back, Seraphina felt something settle in her chest that had been restless since Seattle. Not happiness exactly, more like acceptance. She'd been Emma Russo trying to escape, then Seraphina Vale trying to seize control, then Seraphina Darko learning what happened when you weaponized heartbreak. Now she was just Seraphina. No empire, no performance, no running, just a woman who'd survived every version of herself and decided the next one would be chosen instead of forced. They reached their brownstone as night settled completely over Brooklyn. Lucienne unlocked the door while Seraphina checked her phone out of habit, old instincts dying hard. One new message, unknown number. Her stomach clenched. Then she opened it and laughed. It was Elena. New phone, new life, reaching out after 2 years of silence. Heard you're boring now. Proud of you. Coffee sometime? Seraphina typed back. Yes, but I'm warning you. I only talk about normal things now. Groceries, weather, the aggressive lack of danger in my life. The response came immediately. Perfect. I'm so tired of interesting. They made plans for the following week, caught up on 2 years of rebuilding lives from rubble. Elena was working in corporate security, legitimate work, boring hours, occasionally soul-crushing in its ordinariness. But she was alive, free, building something that didn't require looking over her shoulder. We all survived, Elena said over coffee that cost too much and tasted like burnt optimism. That's more than most people in our situation can say. We did more than survive, Seraphina replied. We walked away. You think it's permanent? Or do you ever worry something will drag us back? Every day, but less over time. Elena nodded slowly. What's the plan long term? You and Lucien going to have kids? Buy a house in the suburbs? Full normalization? Seraphina thought about it. Maybe. I don't know yet. We're learning how to be married for reasons that aren't strategic. Everything else feels very far away. That's fair. You've earned the right to figure it out slowly. They finished their coffee and hugged goodbye outside the cafe. Elena disappeared into the Brooklyn crowd and Seraphina watched her go. Another person who'd survived the empire and chosen something better. Walking home, Seraphina passed the noodle shop where she'd worked during her first week in Brooklyn. Different owners now. Different menu. But the smell was similar enough to trigger memories of Seattle and Chen's Noodle House and the girl who'd thought serving strangers was freedom. She'd been wrong and right simultaneously. Freedom wasn't escape. It was choice. The ability to look at your life and decide what came next without chains, visible or invisible, holding you in place. Seraphina reached her brownstone as autumn rain started falling. Lucien was on the couch, reading with the kind of comfortable focus that came from actually being relaxed instead of performing relaxation. He looked up when she entered. How was Elena? Good. Normal. Successfully boring. The dream. Seraphina hung up her coat and sat beside him. Outside, rain streaked the windows. The city hummed with its usual chaos. Somewhere Thomas Darko was in a cell thinking about the empire he'd destroyed. Somewhere Nolan Pierce was living with guilt, or maybe without it. Somewhere Roman Vale was watching seasons change and accepting that his legacy was complicated at best. And here, in this brownstone that wasn't fortified or strategic or connected to anything except mortgage payments, Seraphina and Lucien were building something that would never make headlines or require violence to maintain. Something small, something honest, something that belonged entirely to them. You know what I realized today? Seraphina said quietly. What? That I'm not running anymore. Not from my father, not from the past, not from who I was or who I'm becoming. She looked at him. I'm just here, present, choosing this. Lucien set his book aside. Choosing what specifically? You. This life? The boring, normal, terrifying, beautiful reality that we're actually free. That sounds suspiciously like emotional growth. I know. It's very uncomfortable. He pulled her close, and they sat together while rain turned Brooklyn streets shiny and dark. No bodyguards outside. No surveillance. No threats except the ordinary dangers of loving someone enough that losing them would hurt. It was the most vulnerable Seraphina had ever allowed herself to be. And it felt like finally coming home to a place she'd been running toward her whole life without knowing it existed. Later that night, lying in bed while Lucian slept beside her, Seraphina thought about Emma Russo one last time. The girl who'd wanted love and second chances and to believe that being ordinary was enough. She'd been naive, foolish, vulnerable in ways that had been weaponized against her. But she'd also been right about something important, that you couldn't run from yourself forever, that eventually you had to stop and figure out who you actually were underneath all the performance and survival and violence. Seraphina Vale Darko had been a lot of things: daughter of a crime lord, runaway princess, weapon wrapped in silk, woman who'd faked her father's death and walked through fire to save the man she married. Now she was just Seraphina. No empire, no cage, no carefully constructed identity designed to survive in her father's world. Just a person learning slowly and painfully how to be human after spending 28 years being everything else. It wasn't the fairy tale Emma had wanted. It was something better, something real, something earned through every hard choice and broken piece and moment she'd decided survival wasn't enough anymore. She'd wanted to outrun her father's empire. Instead, she'd learned to carry it differently, as history instead of destiny, as lesson instead of life sentence. And somewhere in that transformation, between the courthouse vows and the warehouse violence and the federal testimony that had burned everything down, she'd found exactly what she'd been running toward. Not safety, not escape, not love without complications, just the freedom to choose what came next, and the courage to build it with someone who'd seen every version of her, the broken and the dangerous and the desperately hopeful, and chosen her anyway. That was the real victory, not the empire saved or destroyed, not the enemies defeated or the power seized, just two people who'd survived the worst their worlds could throw at them and decided that surviving wasn't enough. They wanted to actually live. And every morning they woke up in that Brooklyn brownstone with no bodyguards and no federal agents watching and no legacy except what they built themselves. That was a choice to keep living, to keep trying, to keep becoming something better than what they'd been trained to be. Outside, dawn was breaking over Brooklyn. Rain had stopped. The city was waking up to another ordinary day and millions of ordinary lives. Seraphina closed her eyes and let sleep take her. Tomorrow she'd wake up beside Lucian, make coffee, go to class, live another day of the beautifully mundane existence she'd earned through fire. But tonight, right now, she let herself rest. Not as weapon or princess or runaway or queen, just as Seraphina. Finally, completely, dangerously free. And that was enough.